how are we recognizing and receiving the gift of God? But one thing that I came across was Father Peter Hunter, OP. A quote I got from him is he said, Jesus is a guest in the house of Martha, but it is Mary who finds her home at Jesus' feet and is fed by his words. Abraham and Sarah received the three men and show their generosity to their guests, but the men are there to bring God's generosity to them. The thought that came on my mind was, are we seeing God pass by? Because in both the Genesis and the gospel reading, it seems like God or the divine is passing by. And are we able to open the doors of ourselves, of our homes, literally and figuratively, to allow God to come in and pour God's gift upon us? God is on a journey in these readings. Are we being receptive to God? Because God is really giving us a gift. And so, can we receive that?
That was a lovely quote because it broadens actually our receptivity of the message, right? Gives us a broader perspective of the two readings, which certainly, as often happens, are linked, right? The first reading and the gospel is linked. The abundance, over the top welcome that Abraham gave to his guests just reminds me of the abundance of welcome that is God and was the catalyst for all creation, including people. It's an annunciation story, isn't it, really? Because there are some in the Hebrew scriptures, and this is one of them. And your thought makes me think that if Abraham wasn't paying attention, I'll say, look what would have been missed. It was an intervention, really, by God into history through Abraham and Sarah, not just something that naturally happens. It was definitely an intervention. So it turns out that these guests are divine. And Abraham, even without knowing that, just goes above and beyond to give them a welcome. I love that idea of welcome, and was struck by the different tone actually in the gospel regarding welcome from the first reading in Genesis about Abraham.
You mentioned how something may have been missed if Abraham didn't receive God. And even in that, I think there's what I'm thinking like a paradox where it seems like Abraham is being hospitable to these guests, which are divine. But in actuality, the guests are the ones who are being hospitable or are gifting Abraham and Sarah. And so, in one way, I look at it is when we are welcoming and neighborly to and loving to others, it may seem like we're giving people stuff or providing something for them, but in actuality, the gift is being given to us by us. It kind of becomes a mutual gift giving opportunity because it doesn't fall on one person, one party giving another to another. It's more about that mutual relationship of gift giving one another. Um, and it first starts, or it can start with one party, one side, opening up themselves and being in service, serving someone else. And in that, kind of paradoxically, we ourselves are gifted something by giving away ourselves to the other.
This mutuality, I think, is very significant. How many times, if you ever speak to people about the experience of doing something, justice work or charitable work, and the people find that they come away grateful because of the change they experience in themselves as a result of whatever they're doing. That happens over and over and over again. It impacts people who are open to it, right? Who are open to it. And that's why I liked your pointing out the movement, like Abraham looks off sitting at the door of his tent, and he sees the people coming. That whole idea of God moving, I think that's not a small piece of this story. The movement, we've talked about this before, this whole trajectory of God thing, this movement of things, but which also, if we're paying attention, poises us for the mutuality if we realize the whole dynamic of, in this case, what welcome is. And too many times I have thought that people orchestrate a moment and they deem it a success if everything goes according to plan. And in extreme cases, it's micromanaging. But no matter what it is, we lose the sense of mutuality because of the investment we have in structuring whatever is going to happen. So it has to be deliberate. If you can, there's more possibility for this mutuality. God's plan and love and kingdom vision is coming, is moving towards what God wants in life with all of these little steps. And Abraham and Sarah ended up maybe lagging a little bit, but at least being open to that. I think that idea of movement is really important. If we realized that everything was evolving, it doesn't evolve around us. We're part of the evolving. If we were realizing that, I think we'd pay attention a whole lot differently.
Another thing that kind of stood out for me was the idea that in this Gospel of Luke, at this point, Jesus is already on his journey to Jerusalem, to Calvary. And so it's kind of like an invitation for us as disciples to join him. But even in trying to join him in his journey to Calvary, we have to understand what that means and what that entails. And so going along with this kind of idea of a movement, before we can actually follow Jesus to the cross, I think we understand what exactly that means. And I think that's where kind of the idea of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, I think it's been described as that's what people of that time did between a student-teacher relationship, was sit. And so I think that's kind of connecting kind of the overarching idea of that journey. I think that's what I kind of started thinking about it, was Jesus and his journey to Calvary, and we are meant to follow, but we have to first really understand and listen to Jesus teach us about what that means. And we can't just kind of so yes, we encountered God, we encountered Jesus in our lives in different moments, different times. We hopefully recognize and receive what we receive God, but at the same time we have to receive in order to understand it in ourselves journey, make that journey to Calvary as well.
I was just reading this week's about this is following up on what you said about following Jesus to Calvary. I think it is hugely important to understand how Jesus is moving into this paschal mystery of his life. Sometimes I feel we just say, oh yes, I've suffered, life is hard, and everybody suffers, and that's just the lot of us on earth. But I think it misses the point that you bring up. The reason that there was resurrection, I think, is the way Jesus moved to Jerusalem and died. the way he did it. And what I mean by that is, yes, he was a victim because he's the one that was crucified, but there was this consciousness of his being completely focused on the truth that he knew because of how he related to God the Father, to God his Father, whom he called his Father, and then how he died with forgiveness. I think that's what brought about this transformation that was resurrection, that just kept on growing and expanding and moving ahead. I don't think it's big enough to just say, yes, Jesus died on the cross and I have cancer. So, I don't think it's big enough to say that. I think it's what we have to do is what Mary did. We have to receive from Jesus Christ this heart receptivity, actually, because it's a way to move through life in a receptive way that allowed Jesus to embrace his death, and make it a paschal mystery in which life was stronger than that death. So I think you hit on something very important there that sometimes we miss.
The last point I took from these readings was how Abraham and I guess Mary and Martha couldn't have completely known that God was present in their guests. So from a kind of just ordinary lived experience, they probably just thought it was another person, at least initially. And so an underlying kind of thought is there was divinity in those people. And so that leads me to start thinking, when we ourselves encounter our neighbors, our guests, are we seeing the divine in them? And what does that kind of lead us to then grow from that idea that anyone can have the divine in them? And how can we ourselves treat them as such? Hospitality.
Yes, that's really important, isn't it? If you just sit with that thought for a minute, that's explosive, really. There was Golden Legends, which is the book that Ignatius of Loyola read when he was recuperating from his war wounds, which was kind of dismissed because I think the author, by the way, was a Dominican. I think the author made up things to just suit his purposes about these people. It certainly is not history the way we think of history now. But when you said this, one of the saints that has been actually taken off the church calendar now, because I think the church is not sure that this person ever existed, was Christopher. The story that he carried this person across the river, and the person got heavier and heavier and heavier, and he didn't know if he was going to make it to the other side. And just before he did, the person he was carrying transmuted into Jesus Christ, the figure of the Christ child, saying that everybody you carry, Christopher, that's why he's called Christopher, right? Christ bearer. Everyone you carry, that you have carried, you've been carrying me. So the point in this book of Golden Legend was less historicity than it was your point. That was what the author wanted, I think, to give people this theological truth of what you just said. Everybody is a Christ bearer. And if you could realize that truth, life would just be totally different. So the Dominican who wrote that book was more concerned about these principles that shape our faith than he was about actually using historical people. But I think your thought is very important. This week on Monday was the feast of Benedict of Norcia, an Italian Benedict who lived in the 500s, the 6th century, and he's called the father of monasticism. But he built his whole order on not just the 3 vows that religious take, but living in community and having hospitality as part of their major characteristics, as one of their major characteristics. So, and the root word of hospitality is guest, treating everybody as a guest, right? So they answered everybody who came to the door of the monastery. They protect the village by letting them all come in and lock the outer gates so that they'd be safe during an uprising. They started the first hospitals. Even hospitals began because originally you were supposed to give a welcome to everyone who came in, to treat everyone who came as a guest. It was rooted, we're so far from that now, it's a business, but it was rooted in just this last thing you said, this idea of hospitality, giving a welcome and being changed. This is my other point, and being changed because of it. So the Benedictines, until well into the, for centuries and centuries, I can't even give an end date, they were not only forces of stability within the communities that they were in, but they were also agents of change. That's what real welcome does to you. That's what the mutuality of welcome does to you.